Hey guys, welcome back to the Knife Life. Today we're talking with Michael Janich, head instructor and founder of the Martial Blade Concepts system, and also the guy who's really responsible for the evolution of the modern Wharncliffe knife. Thanks for having us. Just for the people who aren't really familiar with who you are, can you give us just a quick background on your knife making and knife designing background?
As far as knife stuff goes, I've been a knife collector all my life. Really kind of came, I guess, into the public eye around 1992. I wrote my first book, Knife Fighting: A Practical Course. Had been training in knife combatives for a long, long time. And around that time is also when I started writing for various magazines, writing for Fighting Knives magazine and a bunch of other magazines. Around 98, I had the opportunity to be one of the first designers for the Masters of Defense knife company. So 5 different knife designers, and I was honored to be one of those. Since then, I've designed knives for Combat Elite, for the Spyderco Knife Company, for Blackhawk Products Group, which I also manage both their Masters of Defense and Blackhawk Blades product lines. So been involved formally in the knife industry since about 1992. Have been writing and contributing and designing pretty much ever since.
So a lot of our people don't actually know what a Wharncliffe is. It's a little bit more of the obscure style of blade. Can you define what a Wharncliffe actually is for them?
Basically, the easiest way to think of a Wharncliffe is a perfectly straight cutting edge, and then what you have is the spine of the blade comes down to meet that edge. So that can either be kind of a sweeping curve, which is the way the original Wharncliffes were done, but later Wharncliffes would also have, in some cases, more of a straight spine that would come down and converge with the cutting edge. Where it really comes from, the best we can figure historically, is in the early part of the 19th century, there was a member of kind of British aristocracy who later became known as Lord Wharncliffe. And he was a knife enthusiast. He lived near Sheffield in England, and he was kind of bored with the designs that were happening at that time. So he wanted to come up with something that was a little bit different, a little bit more functional for his use of a utility knife. And he kind of designed the original straight edge blade, again, with more of a curving spine that came down to meet it. And that blade design became associated with him, especially once he was recognized as Lord Wharncliffe. And what you see is, starting kind of in the middle 19th century and certainly into the later 19th century, a lot of the knife catalogs and the commercial knives that were made in England would make reference to the Wharncliffe style blade in his honor.
So one of the things that I encounter just in my research is that a lot of people like to attribute the Wharncliffe design originally back to about the 11th century with the Viking sax knives. Is that did it evolve from that, or is that an entirely different evolution of blades from there?
I think it's like most things in history, where what you have is a good idea is not necessarily confined to one person.
Yeah.
So you'll have people who will come up with the same epiphany in different places in the world at different times. And certainly, like they say, history is always written by the victors. So whoever has the best platform for claiming their stake to history usually is the one who gets the credit. But when you look at straight bladed designs, first of all, straight blades in any context have been around forever.
Yeah.
I mean, when you look at like the original Japanese swords, they were straight bladed instead of the curved blades that we've come to associate with traditional katana and wakizashi and everything else. A lot of that was simply based on technology. It was easier for them to make a straight blade than it was for them to make a curved blade. Also, what you'll find with swords is that once cavalry was introduced, the idea of a straight blade, where when you struck something, you dumped all your energy into the target, that was not really good when you're riding at a full gallop on a horse, because now all that energy is transferred back into your arm and your shoulder and can cause you some really serious injury. So the curved blade would allow you to dissipate force, and it just made more sense. As you got longer blades, you also needed the curve to be able to draw the sword, because longer swords, obviously if they're straight, you run out of arm and you simply can't get the sword out of the scabbard. So when you look at historically blades across the world, you'll find straight bladed knives that have been used in various places, various cultures for many centuries.
So it sounds pretty much like the modern Wharncliffe doesn't really trace its lineage back to the old school swords and stuff beforehand. It developed pretty much entirely on its own, and from Lord Wharncliffe is where everything is headed from.
The aspect of Lord Wharncliffe, what he was looking at, again, he was a member of British aristocracy, and he was essentially looking at it as a pocket knife. So he was concerned primarily with utility use, a smaller knife, something for everyday chores, that type of thing. When you look at like the Scramasax and what you would see as far as the Vikings, when you look at the Compilan in Filipino culture, actually if you look even in European culture as far as a lot of the executioner swords, they tended to be straight blades as well because they wanted to dump full power and make sure they got the job done. The mechanics of a straight cutting edge were well known in various contexts, but when it comes to the Wharncliffe, really it's kind of the confining that concept to more of a smaller knife, something that's more for utilitarian purposes, something for everyday carry.
Gotcha. And so you've been talking a little bit about the cutting mechanics of the Wharncliffe, which is really why it shines. So can you go into a bit more depth on the actual cutting mechanics of why we're interested in this particular style of blade?
Sure. So one way to illustrate that, when we look at, here we have training blade, so it's nice because you can actually feel, one of the ways to understand this is with a training blade you can actually feel it on your own skin, or if you're doing martial arts training, work with a partner and have them feel it and provide you feedback. But when you look at the way the body moves, the body is basically designed to move in arcs. So anytime you're wielding a weapon, when you're swinging the knife, you're basically pivoting at your elbow, pivoting at your shoulder. You have some type of combination of mechanical movements that create an arc. Okay, so when you're doing that, what essentially happens is the cutting edge at the end of the arc, as long as it's relatively straight, when you make contact, you're dumping full power of that arc into whatever the target is. Okay, once you get to the point where you start to have curve or belly to the edge, what ends up happening is the arc of motion of my arm and the curve start to coincide. Essentially, this ends up representing the outside radius of the arc of motion of my arm. So as you're coming through here, I'm applying pressure, applying pressure, applying pressure. Here I run parallel to that radius, and I no longer apply any pressure into the target, and I'm not cutting any deeper. When you look at a Wharncliffe, when you turn this over, what ends up happening is I'm cutting with full power, I'm cutting with full power, I'm cutting with full power. You never get to a point to where the arc of the edge ends up paralleling that arc of motion of the arm. So you're constantly cutting with full power all the way to the point. There's no point where that dissipates. When you look at things like the Americanized Tonto, so this is actually a Wharncliffe, you turn it over. One of the things that irritates me is people talking about, well, it's a reverse Tonto. Wharncliffe, the term Wharncliffe predates the idea of the Americanized Tonto. So when you look at terminological stuff and everything as far as knives go, understanding history helps a lot.
Yeah.
But if you go back to kind of a Japanese style Tonto where you'd have the Kisaki, the faceted tip here, again what you'd have is full power, full power. When you get to the point where you have this angle here, again, that's going to dissipate force. You're not going to cut very deeply with this portion here because even though it's not curved, it still comes close to paralleling that arc of motion of the arm. Mm-hmm. Again, when you go back to the straight cutting edge, full power, full power, full power, all the way to the point.
Yeah.
And this is also why when you look at utility knives, people who are using the Stanley utility knives, X-Acto knives, a lot of the stuff that is used in more of a utilitarian context or a trade context, in a lot of cases they're going to have Wharncliffe blades because what you want is that full cutting power all the way to the point.
Gotcha. Excellent. So you're really the guy who's responsible for bringing the Wharncliffe into a modern use, especially in the tactical use.
Specifically as far as tactical, I would say, because Wharncliffe blades, again, have been with us forever. I mean, when you look at wood carving blades and everything, from a utilitarian standpoint, the Wharncliffes have been around for a long time. They've been in consistent use and in consistent production really since the 19th century. Mm-hmm. That's never really gone away. But when it comes to the tactical side, especially as far as small knives, again, tactical, the Scramasax was definitely tactical to the Vikings. The Compilan was tactical to the Filipinos. But when you look at adapting that to a smaller knife, something designed for everyday personal defense carry, that's something that I think I kind of really helped pioneer and was one of the first people to really embrace that seriously, I think.
Yeah. So we have an entire table full of knives, and some of them are actually very unique. These pretty much tell the story of the progression of the Wharncliffe to as we know it now in a tactical situation. So can you take us through the evolution of the
walk you
Wharncliffe?
through history, sure.
Excellent.
So again, we're all products of our own experience. In some cases, victims of our own experience. So here we have. This is the first knife that I designed for commercial production. So this is the Tempest from Masters of Defense. This happens to be one of the early custom ground versions. And when I was approached to design something for Masters of Defense, I literally had a very short period of time. I got to design a knife in about a week. And they said, design something, get it to us, give us machinist drawings. So what I designed was what I thought a tactical knife should be at that time. Based on my research, based on everything I'd learned up until that point, you wanted to have belly to the edge because belly supposedly gave you more of a cutting edge, more linear length of the cutting edge, and that would complement what you do as far as the motion of your arm. It supposedly would cut and slash better. So that's what I designed back when I had that chance. As I started to learn things, and especially as I started to get more involved in validating things through empirical testing, meaning the Porkman demonstration that I kind of developed. You take a pork tenderloin or a pork roast, sizable piece of meat, about 3 to 5 pounds, butterfly it, so you slit it, wrap it around a piece of dowel, tie it on with a bunch of twine, wrap it with a bunch of plastic wrap. So what you have is a pretty significant chunk of meat that would replicate like a human arm or a human leg, and then actually doing live blade cutting on that. Mm-hmm. Once I started doing that type of testing, what I found was when I had the opportunity to design a second knife, I went through everything in my collection, including my original Tempest, and I started cutting, and I realized when I got to blades that had a much straighter cutting edge, especially for small blades, everyday carry personal defense items, stuff with straighter edges cut deeper. And one of the ones that really impressed me that cut the best, this is one of the early old school Spyderco Senofontes. So there are actually two versions of this made. There was a smaller one and a larger one. Frank Senofonte was a custom maker who was very well known for his time, passed away several years ago, but great guy. And what you had was a very elegant, very sleek design. And you had essentially that straight cutting edge and the spine curved down to meet that. And what I realized is when I started doing live blade cutting with this, nothing else that I had in my collection, especially anything that had any kind of belly to it, would match the depth of cut that I was getting with this. So I started thinking about it and started working with trainers, started feeling the pressure and everything else. And I realized, hey, the straighter the cutting edge, the more that you can transfer that power along the entire length of the edge, which of course is particularly important when you're limited as far as edge length with what you can carry. So this knife here, when I had an opportunity, actually let me back up just one. We'll go to this one here first. There's a guy named Mike Snowdy who was a custom knife maker, and Mike, I'd written up some of his stuff for Tactical Knives magazine, helped launch his career as a full-time custom knife maker, and he was like, hey, I want you to design a knife. I want the ultimate neck knife, and I want to thank you for your efforts to launch my career. And what I came up with was this. So this was the original Janich Snowdy Ronin. So what I had was perfectly straight cutting edge, kind of a faceted spine that came down, lots of jimping here because I like the thumb forward grip in NBC style, and essentially index finger choil here, which is inspired by Fred Perrin, tapered handle here that fits the ergonomics of the hand. And what you had was essentially a fixed blade knife that cut with more effect given its given blade length than you would find with other blade profiles. Mm-hmm. Mike Snowdy at first was kind of skeptical. Once he actually made one and started cutting with it, he was a lot more impressed. Once he cut himself with it, he was even more impressed.
Can you tell us that full story?
So what ended up happening, he told me this later on, because what had happened actually, if we back up even further, this is the original concept model. Oops, excuse me. No, this is the Spyderco version. My bad. So again, back to the Snowdy version. What he had done was he made up the knife, made up the blade, had the knife probably about 2/3 done. Uh-huh. And what he had was kind of a series of shadow boxes, almost like mail slots that you would have for like a hotel or something like that. And he put this knife in one of the mail slots. And he's like, I'll get back to it later. I'm still not convinced that Janich's goofy design is going to be worth anything. When he reached in to get the knife out to kind of re-examine it, he reached in and the point was sticking in this way. And he said he literally hit himself kind of right about here and slit his hand all the way to the heel of the palm. And he said it was just a clean cut with like no resistance whatsoever. And he pulled his hand out. He was bleeding like a pig. And he ended up bandaging himself up, finished the knife, put the handle on, all that kind of stuff. And then he started doing some cutting tests. So he was cutting different cardboard, different materials and stuff like that. And it was funny because when he finally called me up, he'd called me up and we talked about it a little bit. And when he was unconvinced, I said, you know what, forget it. Drive on. I wish you all the best. Don't worry about it. When he called me up, his literal words were, you evil motherfucker. And I'm like, excuse me? And he's like, yeah, this is Mike Snowdy, you evil motherfucker. I've never had a knife that cut like that before. I didn't realize it was because he cut himself. He admitted that later on. But once he got the concept of it, I kind of explained, look, this is the way it works. And especially with the edge geometry he was using was a full hollow grind and a complete flat on the other side, which gave you a very thin behind the edge geometry. At that point, he was a believer. So that's kind of where that came from. The next step in evolution from that was I started teaching for Spyderco. So before I became an employee for Spyderco, Spyderco was interested in having me teach the NBC system for them. Once I started doing that, they said, hey, we should have a knife design with you. I showed them the Snowdy design. They're like, yeah, that's kind of cool. We like that. Let's do a factory version of it. So that ended up becoming this version. So this was the Spyderco produced Ronin. They did a full flat grind on each side instead. They didn't want to do a hollow grind. Sal told me that they would never do a hollow grind, although they reneged on that a little bit later on. But this became the Spyderco production version, and it was credited to me and Mike Snowdy. So this, from a commercial standpoint, the world wasn't quite ready for it. From a production standpoint, the producer that Spyderco had doing these in Japan, the consistency of their handle thickness made it hard to mass produce sheaths, so it became kind of problematic as far as production goes, so it only did one production run. Also at that time, Spyderco was much better known for its folding knives, so they were like, hey, can we do a folder version of it? So this one here is actually one that I made. It's kind of a very much a Frankenstein knife. Doesn't really represent great knife making skill, but it got the point across. So I showed this to Sal and I said, you know, this is kind of what I have in mind. Obviously, thumb stud is a no-go as far as Spyderco stuff goes because of the trademark round hole. So we reworked the design and essentially came up with what became the first generation Yojimbo, which means bodyguard in Japanese. Spyderco had that design in about 2000. I'd roughed it out for them and everything, had made a plastic model. They were going through some challenges at the time, and it was kind of slow coming into fruition. So what I did was I went back to Mike Snowdy and I said, hey, Mike, I want to try to kickstart this process a little bit. Would you do me a favor and make a one-off Yojimbo? I want you to make it, put it up on the internet, kind of show it off and see if we can't start a fire and get people interested in it. So he made this version, D2 tool steel. It's a hollow grind on each side. The cutting edge itself is actually a chisel. Lots of jimping on the back for the thumb forward grip, contoured carbon fiber scales, titanium liners, liner lock mechanism, just a beautiful knife. And he did exactly one of these. Put the picture up on the internet, stirred some shit, got some people fired up, and it inspired Spyderco to follow through on what became the Spyderco Yojimbo. So what's unique about this one here, when you look at this, you notice that the blade is relatively short. It's a 3-inch blade because I designed this back in 2000 prior to 9/11. Back then, you could still carry knives on planes. Even during heightened security, you could carry a 3-inch blade. So I designed this so worst case scenario, you could still carry this on a plane. I still wanted a full-size handle so you could have a full grip for a reasonable sized hand. You also had enough puño or butt of the weapon to be able to strike with. So this became the first generation Yojimbo. A lot of people looked at that and said, wow, that's really kind of weird. That's different. I don't really get it. There were 2 versions made, a blue handle version and a black handle version, both with G10 handles. The blue handle versions, I believe there was more of those made than the black handle, although the black handle is kind of more coveted these days. Commercially, it wasn't super successful because people just didn't get it. Where it became successful is when I would start teaching NBC classes, and I would take this out and do Porkman demonstrations with it and explain the virtues of the Wharncliffe blade. People were like, holy crap, I want one of those.
I remember those classes, yes.
Yep. And it was great because I'd walk in with, a box of Yojimbos, and people are like, that's a goofy looking knife. And then I'd do the demo, and it's like, give me one, and I'd sell out at every seminar. Because once people understood the mechanics behind it, it made sense. So as we keep moving forward, again, Mike Snowdy, I influenced him. This is actually a knife that he made. His style ended up changing significantly after we ended up working together. He switched to a lot more of Wharncliffe style blades, got away from kind of the Japanese style blades that he was making at the time. And he also had an opportunity to work with Benchmade and do some designs for them as a collaborator. So he came up to me at the Blade Show one day and showed me a prototype of this. And he's like, what do you think of it? And I'm like, it looks really familiar. And he's like, well, it should. You pretty much designed it. He said, this is my take on your original Yojimbo design. And at that time, the Spyderco version had not come out yet. He asked my blessing if he could drive forward and have this produced with with Benchmade. This became the Benchmade Gravitator. But when you look at all the functional aspects of this, the extended thumb ramp, the Wharncliffe style blade and everything, literally, he was already a believer in the design. So he ended up becoming, started doing some proselytizing for the Wharncliffe blade outside of just the Spyderco realm. And that was one of the things that helped give it legitimacy behind, or besides just me as the one guy out there screaming Wharncliffe, Wharncliffe. So that kind of helped it take off. When I went to work for Spyderco back in 2009 as a full-time employee, we kind of revisited the whole thing, and Sal Glesser said, hey, we'd like to have you design another knife for Spyderco. Now that you're a full-time employee, you're fully on board, can you design something for us? And I said, well, you know what? I learned a lot since I designed this, and I have some ideas for kind of a second generation Yojimbo. And it became this. This happens to be the black-bladed version. So what I did was refine the ergonomics, shorten the handle, lengthen the blade, because we no longer had the 3-inch requirement. It was no longer really relevant. I wanted something that would fit, that would basically fit kind of the Colorado legal limits, 3.5-inch blade. This is actually about 3 1/4. But just kind of refined the design, still thumb forward, got rid of the jimping or the textured grooves on the back, so you still have that thumb forward grip, but really just kind of everything that I'd learned in the roughly 9-10 years since I designed the first one, kind of incorporated into this. And then history kind of reversed itself. Folder came first. I was teaching Mickey Yurko, custom knife maker, showed him the folder version. Mickey doesn't make folders, but he ended up tracing the design, made the first, what became the Ronin 2. So essentially, if we consider the Ronin to be the fixed blade expression, the Yojimbo to be the folder, Mickey made this based off of the folding version. Spyderco saw this, they took a liking to it, and they said, hey, can we put this into the prototype case? They showed it off, and that ultimately kind of came full circle to the Spyderco Ronin 2. So this is currently in production. The Yojimbo 2 is also in production. And that's kind of in a nutshell, kind of the evolution from about 2000 to this one came out about 2016 or so.
And so that's really the current state of the Wharncliffe at the moment.
As far as my designs are concerned, one other one that is out there currently, I don't have a sample here at the moment, but the Yojumbo, which is a little bit larger version of the Yojimbo, just kind of scaled up for larger hands or people who can carry longer blade length. But what's interesting about it, what's gratifying for me is if you go back and you look, again, the knife world is full of history. There's all kinds of history out there, and the more that you dig into that history, the deeper the understanding that you'll have of kind of where things came from, how ideas could have popped up simultaneously in different places and stuff like that. But what you'll find is if you look at old catalogs, if you look at an old Benchmade catalog, if you look at Kershaw catalogs and everything else, you're not going to see Wharncliffes back in the early 2000s. Spyderco, to their credit, really kind of took a chance on me, and a lot of it was because I was able to articulate to Sal, this is why I want this knife to be this way. It wasn't an aesthetic expression, it was a purely functional expression. And I said, I wanted to do these things for this reason. And Sal was like, okay, cool, we'll run with it. And it wasn't really until a number of years later that people started to really understand the tactical advantages of the Wharncliffe. One thing we haven't really talked about is from a functional standpoint, why should we care about a Wharncliffe at all? You may be watching this video and saying, I'm interested in knives, but not so much combatively. One of the great things about the Wharncliffe, when you look at its function, when you're cutting with power, you're typically working in the area close to the heel of the edge. So if you're cutting a piece of rope, if you're whittling a fuzz stick or something like that, you're working with the heel of the edge here. Closest to your hand, you have the most control, you have the most leverage. As you get farther and farther away from the hand, the length of the blade tends to work against your grip, and the leverage is counterproductive. But with this, what you have is essentially you can apply pressure with pretty consistent force along most of the edge. What's really nice is, especially with a wider blade, you can also choke up on this. So if you needed to dig out a splinter, if you needed to do something that really required scalpel-like precision, you can work with the tip and have something that really gives you control that you wouldn't have with other blade designs. When you have something that has a lot of belly to the blade and you're trying to choke up like this and get close to the point, it's really awkward to use. But with this, again, you can literally skip up past the handle, get onto the blade, and use this with great precision, as well as cutting with great power. So from a utilitarian standpoint, again, going back to its original namesake, to Lord Wharncliffe, it's a very practical design. From a defensive standpoint, what it gives you is maximum cutting power in the smallest package possible. And one of the other advantages of it, when you look at thrusting, if we go back to something like this, if we imagine this being thrust into a target, what ends up happening is the point starts to penetrate, but most of what is widening that wound channel is the edge here. So as you drive that in, this cutting edge has to do all the work. And it's just not a really efficient process. And I've verified this, built a ballistic pendulum, basically a big swinging arm, swinging into a target so you have the same impact every time, and tested it with different blade shapes. And one of the interesting things is when I tested the Wharncliffe, what was happening in most cases, I would swing the arm down, it would stick into the foam target, and it would stay. And then I'd mark it with a piece of tape, pull it out, measure the depth of penetration, log my result, and essentially use scientific process as much as possible. When I did that with a Wharncliffe, what ended up happening was it swung down and it bounced out. And I'm thinking, oh no, I designed a knife that bounces off the target rather than penetrating it when I try to thrust. And it just didn't make sense because it wasn't sticking into the target and staying the way everything else was. So to understand what was happening, I'm looking at the target and I'm seeing what looks like good penetration, but the blade isn't staying in the target. So I took the blade and I colored it with dry erase marker. Mm-hmm. What I realized is it was going in all the way, penetrating completely, hitting the front of the handle, and then bouncing all the way back out. The reason I realized was when you thrust with a Wharncliffe, penetration is always going to be determined by the acuteness of the tip. So as this goes in, what actually ends up happening is the ramp on the back of the blade, the unsharpened ramp, pushes downward and it drives the cutting edge into the bottom of the wound channel. So it opens essentially from the top down and it shears along the length. So it actually penetrates way better than knives that have belly to them because it's not penetrating with the edge, it's truly penetrating with the point and using the spine of the blade to drive the cutting edge downward.
So in talking with you so far, the Wharncliffe seems to outperform more of the traditional blade, and with the belly on this tip, pretty much in every fashion. So it cuts more aggressively, it has a little bit more utilitarian value in terms of being able to actually choke up on the blade, and it thrusts more aggressively. Is there any area where that actually doesn't outperform more of the traditional bellied knife?
So what you'll find is when you look at blades with belly, what it really allows you to do, if we go back to that idea of your arm moving in an arc, okay, so if you look at skinning knives, if you look at caping knives, if you look at any kind of knife like an ulu, which is designed for working with meat and stuff like that, one of the reasons those knives work well for what they're doing is it allows you to use that curving motion to cut with extreme depth control. Okay, so if you imagine that you're skinning something and it's like, okay, I'm field dressing this animal, I don't want to puncture the intestines and spoil the meat. So I want to have precise control as far as depth of cut. The curved blade is where it works. You wouldn't want a Wharncliffe for that type of thing. So what you'll see is most skinning knives have lots of belly to the edge. When you look at knives that are used for, again, skinning and preparing hides, again, you want that controlled depth of cut. So you're constantly be using that motion of curving the motion of your hand, curving the motion of the edge, so those two run parallel, and you're cutting in very incremental. The depth of cut is very incremental. You can control it very, very well. The Wharncliffe is the opposite of that. So again, when you go back to Stanley utility knives, X-Acto knives, all that type of thing, the trade-off that you'll find, and what a lot of people will criticize about a Wharncliffe is, it's like, oh, well, the tip is too delicate. I can't, the tip is going to break off. It's going to do something, especially in a tactical knife. So it's interesting because you'll have people be like, well, if I wanted to thrust through somebody's skull with a knife, then the Wharncliffe tip is going to break off. And it's like, that's a possibility, but the more important question is, why are you thrusting
trying
through
to thrust through somebody's skull? Yeah,
exactly. An edge weapon is designed to go against fleshy targets. You should be cutting things or puncturing things to try to achieve a specific effect. When you're using something in a way that really isn't going to produce good results in the first place, it's not a good barometer as far as functionality. One of the interesting things, my full-time job is with Spyderco. My office used to be located right across the hall from Warranty and Repair. So I knew the folks at Warranty and Repair really well. One of the things I would always ask them is, are we getting Yojimbos coming in with broken blades? And they're like, no, there's not. There's no disproportionate number of like broken tips on Yojimbos or anything like that as compared to any other knife. When people decide to use a knife as a pry tool, first of all, it's the wrong tool for the job.
And that'll destroy any knife.
Exactly. The heat treatment is not designed to sustain that. It's just not designed for that type of use. But the bottom line, what's cool about it is, if you imagine, okay, I take this Wharncliffe blade, and for whatever reason I was going after soft tissue and I broke off part of the tip. The great thing about it is, even with part of the tip missing, the straight cutting edge is still going to function just as well as if that tip was still there. It's still going to cut with full power all the way to the point. It really is not going to diminish its functional capacity at all. So there's this perceived belief that, well, the point is very delicate, very dainty. It really isn't. And even if it were to suffer a catastrophic failure in the middle of a defensive situation or something like that, it's really not going to change its functionality at all. And it's, again, like anything else, it's using the right tool for the job. And if your tactics involve thrusting through people's skulls, then yeah, by all means, choose a different blade profile, because I don't want to be associated with you in the first place. I like to hang out with smart people.
So for anybody else who's interested in learning more about Wharncliffes, where can they find more of your stuff or other materials to help them learn more about these blades?
MarshallBladeConcepts.com is my primary website. I have a blog on there. We've written about a bunch of different stuff. So that's a good resource that'll point you toward other things that I would have. Also, of course, when you look at social media, Facebook, Instagram, all that kind of stuff, again, Marshall Blade Concepts is the key term. So whenever I write articles, like I've done articles explaining the evolution of the Wharncliffe for the Knives Annual. I've written for Recoil and Off-Grid magazines and had specific articles written on that type of stuff. And a lot of those articles are available not only in the original printed form, but also online. So anything that is related to my name, Wharncliffe, Marshall Blade Concepts, will kind of take you in the right place. If you're really interested in understanding the depth of this stuff, when you go to MarshallBladeConcepts.com, you'll also see references to like the NBC Distance Learning Program, a lot of the educational side of how we approach knife tactics. And a lot of what we do with regard to knife tactics is also making sure that whatever knife we choose from a defensive standpoint is going to be as functional as possible. So that becomes a big part of that educational process. And a lot of the lessons we have, like in the distance learning program, also address this type of knowledge.
Yeah, and what you taught me in that aspect heavily influenced a video that I released earlier about selecting a knife for everyday defensive carry.
It's a logical process.
Yeah, it's very straightforward, since you take these things into account, and the Wharncliffe really matches up with everything extremely well.
And ultimately what it comes down to, if you're still, I understand that there's a lot of conflicting opinions out there. You can choose to believe me or not, doesn't really matter. Bottom line is, whatever you're going to trust your life to, if you're going to carry a knife for defensive purposes, first of all, get training. Mm-hmm. But In addition to that, what you want to look at is, okay, what am I trying to do to whoever is attacking me? I'm trying to stop that person by causing some kind of physical injury. Quantifying the ability of your knife to do that should be an important part of the process. Don't just assume, well, if I do this, it's going to produce this kind of result. So the pork man that we talked about, any kind of live blade cutting that you can do, obviously you have to do it safely, but whatever you carry, validate the cutting performance, the puncturing performance of your knife on a representative target and see how well it works. Try different blade designs. If you do that, which I've been doing for decades, what you're going to find is Wharncliffe blade will consistently outperform the cutting performance of other blade designs. And prove it to yourself. You don't have to believe me. Just go out there and actually test it, do it empirically, and I'm sure you'll come to the same conclusion.
Excellent. Thank you for talking with us, Mike. This was very enlightening.
Awesome. Thank you, James.
Once again, special thank you to Michael Janich for meeting with me and sharing his knowledge. If you are interested in learning more about the Wharncliffe knife, check out the links that he described. I have posted them in the description down below. If you haven't already, please consider liking and subscribing. Until next time, stay safe and keep living the knife life.